Hello and good morning. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us for the latest instalment of TAROE Trust's webinar Wednesdays. A few housekeeping matters first, and then I'll get on to the introductions. So we're recording this session as usual, so that we'll be able to post a recording on YouTube hopefully later today. For those that couldn't join us today, they'll be able to watch it back. We're hosting it on the Zoom webinar platform. I think most of the participants are probably familiar with this already, but we have got a chat function that's available. So please, we'd invite you to raise questions and have discussions within the chat function as we work through today's session. Hopefully there'll be some chances and obvious pauses as we go through to have that, but we've allocated some time at the end of the session as well for that. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our guest speakers today. We've got Malavika Vartak and James Farndon from Amnesty International UK. I'm really pleased to be able to get both James and Malavika today on the back of the publication which came out earlier this year, An Obstacle Course, Homelessness and the Right to Housing. Really interesting, engaging report. Was delighted to read it. It chimed really well with a lot of the things that TAROE Trust have been highlighting and calling for certainly in recent years and in our manifesto for change. It really draws and shines a light on the fact that many of the issues around homelessness and housing more generally are often attributed incorrectly to individual failures and this, in reality, they're often a result of more and broader structural failings in the housing system. So very much we've seen within that report that they're calling on removal of some of the barriers that exist, to increased investment in housing and affordable housing, and more investment in the existing stock as well. Ultimately, that's within an overall call for housing to be a human right. So I'm going to hand over. I'll be in the background. I'll be monitoring the chat function. I'm still here and available as we go through, but I'm now going to hand over to James and Malavika. Welcome.
Thanks, Darren. Thanks everyone for having us. I'm just going to quickly introduce Amnesty International for those of you who don't know who we are, before I then hand over to Malavika to talk a bit more in detail about our report and our research. My name is James, and I work for Amnesty UK in our London office as a campaigner, and Malavika works in our international office as a researcher in the economic, social and cultural rights team. And we've been working together on this report and campaign around homelessness in England. For those of you who don't know or may not know about Amnesty, we're a global human rights organization. We were founded in 1961 in the UK, and our work originally was focused on what we called prisoners of conscience. So people who were imprisoned or faced repression or abuse for their political activism, for their human rights work. But over the years, our work has broadened a lot more, and we now work on a range of cross-cutting human rights issues, from the arms trade to women's rights, gender rights, LGBTI rights, refugee and migrant rights, as well as issues like cybersecurity, and a growing work on economic, social and cultural rights, of which housing is one of those. Amnesty is now a global organization, and we have offices in over 70 countries, and our global office has now devolved regionally as well. So we have offices in Africa, Asia, Latin America, as well as in Europe. And this piece of work is the first piece of work that we've done specifically on homelessness here in the UK, and this research is on England. We have, Malavika herself has done a lot of work on housing globally, including ending forced evictions in Kenya, and also Gypsy, Roma and traveller rights here in the UK. But this piece of work is our first venture into homelessness and the right to housing in England. So I'm going to hand over to Malavika in a moment, who's going to talk through our report in more detail. And then I'm going to talk a bit after that about our campaigning work and what we're trying to achieve in terms of lobbying the government and working in local communities. The one thing I would say is, like, we definitely, Malavika, have done this kind of talk a few times to different audiences, our own members and supporters, other housing organizations, and we do find the best conversation comes from that Q&A, comes from people asking questions, probing us about the report. I think sometimes we're both a bit shy and we like to be kind of brought out by your questions. So please don't feel free to like type in questions in the chat as we go along. I'm sure Malavika will answer them like during the course of her talk, and we can also have a more kind of participatory conversation at the end as well. Great. So I'll hand over to Malavika, and yeah, we can. I'll keep an eye on the chat, Malavika, as well, with questions that are coming in.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me all right? Yeah. Okay. So thank you, James, for that introduction, and I'll jump straight in. And yes, as James said, we realize we've got about an hour for this meeting. We'll keep the presentations slightly short so that we have enough time for questions, because that's the engagement that we're really seeking. So I would like to start by saying a massive thank you to TAROE Trust, to Darren and everybody else for the opportunity to share our work on the right to housing and research on homelessness with all of you. I'm Malavika. Like James said, I work in Amnesty's International Secretariat as the research and policy advisor on a lot of economic and social justice issues. So our team basically works on housing, health, education, which are all human rights. Just like sort of the right to freedom of expression, etc. And I focus mainly on all things related to housing and land. So just to start, to say that even though sort of the start of this research really, and I was very encouraged by this, came from our own members, and there was a membership resolution that asked Amnesty to work on homelessness in England. And as James has said, we have previously worked on housing and forced evictions quite a lot in across the globe, not so much in the UK, but a lot in sort of Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, France, Italy, Serbia, Romania. And so when our members said, well, what do you why don't you work on sort of homelessness in this country? We were very, very happy. And this report is sort of in response to that. But I have to say that we did spend quite a bit of time discussing internally and externally about what value Amnesty could add to this discourse. I mean, unlike in some other places, there has been tremendous work on homelessness carried out over many, many decades by people with lived experience of homelessness, grassroots groups, small and large charities. And the question really was, well, what is it that we can bring to the table? So we had these discussions with a lot of groups that were with people themselves who've experienced homelessness, with a lot of groups that work on this issue. And one of the things that came out of the discussion was that we could contribute towards sort of framing and articulating homelessness from a human rights perspective, and highlighting government failures in acting in line with their human rights obligations. Because one of the things that came out very, very strongly was not just homelessness, but even housing generally in the UK, and not only in England, is still largely seen as a benefit or an act of charity to be given to people who deserve it or who sort of earn it in some ways, as opposed to a human right that is fundamental to human existence. So that's where we are coming from in this report, and sort of contributing to the decades and decades of work done by lots of groups already functioning here. We also reflected a little bit on sort of questions around what exactly would recognizing housing as a human right and homelessness as a violation of a human right mean in practical terms. And there were questions to us saying, oh yeah, it's all very well to have it in law, but what does it mean for the common woman or the common man, or the, and we do try to respond to this question. And in trying to do so, we also sort of looked at international law and looked at, well, what is it that the right to housing actually entails? I mean, we all say, yes, it's a human right. We all have a right to housing, but what is it really? So if that's all right with you, I'll spend a little bit of time sort of explaining on the right to what the right to adequate housing entails. Is that all right? Yeah. Okay.
That sounds great, Malavika. Really appreciate that. Yeah, that would be good.
Thank you. So as you know, so the right to housing is a human right, and it's been established as a human right globally. It is in various international laws and treaties, many of them which the UK has ratified, that means has agreed to abide by. And one of the main legal instrument that articulates what the right to housing is the International Covenant on Economic, social and cultural rights. So in this, as a part of this articulation, what they say that right to housing includes is, the first thing is legal security of tenure. So basically, as we all know, as tenants, or even sort of people living in their own houses, security of tenure is very key, and it's basically something that guarantees legal protection against arbitrary evictions or forced evictions, harassments, arbitrary rent increases, etc. So basically what this means is that everybody must have some kind of security of tenure in the housing that they live in. It doesn't mean that you have to own your own house, but it does mean that that tenancy in these agreements have to have some kind of protection for people. The other part of what the right to housing contains is the availability of services, materials, facilities, and infrastructure. So basically what the law is saying is that your right to housing will not be considered as fulfilled, or if the housing that you have does not have basic services like electricity, water, sanitation, toilets, washing facilities, heating and lighting. So for example, if we found that people were living in homes that did not have one of these, we would say that right to housing is not being fulfilled or is being violated. The other very, very important part of the right to housing for us, especially in England these days, is affordability. It is not enough for people to just have a house or just to have lots of housing like we have right now, but it has to be affordable. So the costs associated with housing should be at such a level that where people don't have to cut back on other essential needs to afford housing. And we're seeing that every day in the papers, that people are having to cut back on food, cut back on something else to be able to afford housing or continue to live in the homes that they live in. The other one, again, for a lot of us in tenancy, is the other aspect of housing is habitability. So the housing has to be one that is habitable. So it has to give protection from the cold, from the damp, from the heat or rain. And we're seeing this a lot, coming up a lot in terms of social housing as well, where people have access to housing, but it's far from habitable and impacts people's health and well-being. The next one is accessibility. So basically housing needs to be accessible to all, including disadvantaged groups belonging to, people with disabilities, people from different communities, different ethnic and minority communities. It has to be non-discriminatory. And the location of housing, and we've seen this in a lot of countries, housing has to be such where the people living there can access healthcare services, schools, child centers, etc. And then the housing has to be culturally adequate. It has to fit the requirements of the community living there. So this is very broad because this is sort of the international framework, and different aspects of it are more relevant in different countries. But like we are saying here, affordability is a big issue. What the right to housing is not, and I think a lot of people, there is a lot of misconception around this is free housing to everybody. And that's when we get pushback a lot. So, oh, so is Amnesty calling for the right to housing? Are you saying that the government should just give free housing to everybody? No, that's not what the right to housing is. But the right to housing is definitely saying that the housing should be affordable to different people on different income levels. It's not enough for it to be only affordable for the rich. So I think that is a key message that we are trying to sort of push forth. The other thing is that where people are not able to afford housing, there has to be some basic sort of shelter or housing provided to them. So people should not be sleeping on the streets, or people should not be rough sleeping. So it's not such a blanket thing as, oh yes, just, you know, people are just calling for free housing to be given to everybody. So this is what the right to housing is, and what we tried to do in the report that Darren has shared is try and look at homelessness and the housing situation in England from a human rights perspective and say, well, do we have affordable housing? Is that leading to more homelessness? Are the shelters, etc., that are provided for people, are they habitable? So we use those criteria, some of them, to see how, whether the country matched up or not to that, to what a human right to housing contains, especially in a context where the government of UK has ratified, so has agreed to abide by this right to housing and sort of bring it in their domestic laws and policies, etc. So it's also interesting to note, so we worked on it, but like James and I were discussing this morning, it is also interesting to note that a rights-based approach to housing is increasingly gaining in ground in the context of the cost of living crisis, where people are being priced out of areas and rental places. As you know, there has been a huge uptick in numbers. In the first 3 months of the year, homelessness was already up by 11%. 1 in 4 households were found to be homeless or at risk of becoming homeless because of loss of a private tenancy, and this has increased by 94% in a year and is the second leading trigger for homelessness in England. Now, these are all figures by Shelter based on government figures, but these are startling figures, and looking at the way things are going, it looks like homelessness is only going to go up, and it's really, really worrying for all of us who are, regular residents in this country, but also working in the sector. Any questions so far, or should I continue?
Malavika, we've got a few questions in the chat.
Right.
But I think maybe let's take them at the end of your
Okay.
the end of what you have to say, because I think we might answer some of these as we go along.
Okay, great. Okay, so just to come back to our report, so while this is sort of broadly the right to housing and covers all aspects of housing, so affordability, accessibility, habitability, our report looks at homelessness. It's only one aspect of it, and our report highlights how using a human rights lens would make it an obligation for governments to not only address homelessness when it happens, but take specific steps to prevent homelessness from happening. So before people get pushed to the brink of homelessness, by building more truly affordable homes that are habitable and hold it to account for social and fiscal policies. So for its policy that would directly or indirectly impact homelessness. So for example, we've seen that research by the National Housing Federation has estimated that there are around 1.6 million households with unmet housing need that would be best met through social renting. So clearly there is a huge gap in social housing stock, and this needs to be filled. So taking a human rights approach to homelessness and housing would not only sort of respond or make the government respond to people who are already facing homelessness, but also for those who could face homelessness or could sort of be brought to that stage at some point, in their lives. Also, and importantly, we found that a human rights framing will change the narrative about homelessness, and that is something that struck us a lot while we were doing this research, is that housing, like I said, housing and homelessness here is still seen very much as a act of charity, and using a human rights framework would change the narrative a bit and move it towards a discourse where people experiencing homelessness or advocating for housing are not seen as people who are waiting for acts of charity or making unreasonable demands, but are advocating as rights holders, claiming their human rights. And I think that is also very important, though less tangible in many ways. So our report, as I said, examines the law, policy and practice on homelessness in England from a human rights perspective. One of the overarching points the report tries to make is that housing provision and homelessness assistance to people experiencing homelessness needs to be is sort of rationed out, and this and this is primarily because when confronted with severe shortages in actual affordable housing, has created a system of rationing and different criteria. And that's why our report sort of talks about an obstacle course. It almost feels like people who are faced with homelessness have to jump over many hoops to be finally deemed as eligible, as sort of worthy of being given somewhere safe to live. So because of this rationing system, what we have now is that local authorities are only duty bound to provide housing to people who are experiencing homelessness if they meet 3 criteria and are deemed eligible, in priority need, and unintentionally homeless. These conditionalities, we found, form a triple barrier that denies thousands of people from their right to adequate housing. The report also highlights how many people who have NRPF status, that's no recourse to public funds, or whose asylum claims have failed, or who are subject to immigration control for other reasons, are not even considered eligible for the most minimal forms of homelessness assistance and advice. They are the ones who are made to fall at the first barrier. So it's not, I mean, even like, and I'll go into a little more detail if you like. Many of you probably would be familiar with this, but even before being given homelessness assistance, if you have certain conditions on your immigration status, you would not get even that little bit of homelessness support. Once you cross that barrier, once you're deemed as eligible, then there are other criteria that come into play, such as priority need and intentionality. And these exclude others from getting the housing they need, because much of this, as many of you might know, it's a very complex system on and how and who is considered to be in priority need, and who and how may be considered to be intentionally homeless, and people having to prove that, that they are indeed in priority need and haven't made themselves homeless. As highlighted by the Homeless Monitor, which is this, which, as you might know, is a study that comes out every year by Crisis. There were around 22,000 homeless households in the year 2020-2021 who were deemed either not to be in priority need or to be intentionally homeless. So what we're seeing is that even when you have crossed the first barrier of eligibility, even then there are literally thousands of people who are not getting the housing support they need because they do not qualify, because they're not either considered to be in priority need, or they've been seen as they've made themselves homeless. We met during the course of our report women who were not given housing even though they were facing homelessness, because their children had been taken into care by social services or family members. And once their children were not with them, they were not considered to be in priority need for accommodation. And given, and we also found, like, through these interviews, that given how fundamental it is to have a safe place to live, to be able to sort of build your life together, this sort of situation where your children are taken into care, you face homelessness, but because your children are not with you, you do not get you do not get housing. It becomes very difficult for these women to then build their life back and so sort of get a job and then get their children back. So making family separation almost almost a permanent phenomenon. The report also highlights how being termed intentionally homeless had a chilling effect on people, and some said that they continued to put up with substandard housing because they feared that they would be termed as intentionally homeless, and then they would be cut off from any kind of support. I remember sort of, doing interviews with people facing homelessness, and we asked this woman why she didn't think she wanted to go to the council at that time to ask for help. And her response was, I didn't want to go there and them to find something and then to say, well, it's your fault, you've made yourself homeless. I didn't want to hear that. It was when you're dealing with so many different things, that's the last thing you want to hear. So it also has a chilling effect on people who may need the support but may hesitate to ask for it. So many people who had experienced homelessness told us about being trapped in precarious living situations because they did not meet one or more criteria that would make them eligible for long-term or even interim housing. They had no choice in such situations to sleep rough, sofa surf, or live in extremely inadequate housing. So, and what we try to do in this report is also to highlight that while sort of rough sleeping is like the sharpest and the most sort of most stark manifestation of homelessness, homelessness as per the legal definition of homelessness in England, which is very wide it's a positive thing that it's very wide. A lot of different people can be are categorized as homelessness, so facing homelessness. For example, people who sofa surf, and this is people living on a temporary basis with either friends or acquaintances or sometimes even strangers, are also deemed as facing homelessness. If you're living in a house that is extremely overcrowded, and there are clear criteria for that, or extremely sort of unsafe in terms of is uninhabitable, in terms of mold or heating or sort of the sanitation, no proper toilets, you could have sort of an environmental assessment done and you could be considered homeless. So and the point is that once you are considered homeless, then your local council has a duty to house you. But what we've seen is that if this is the case, because of the many different criteria, many people fall through these gaps. So in this report, what we also try and do is shine the spotlight on 3 categories of people facing homelessness. And this is drawn from the interviews and group discussions that we had during the research. So we sort of try and focus a little bit on women and their experience of homelessness, people subject to immigration control, so people with no recourse to public fund status, and people who had spent time in prison. In these sections, we try and drill down on a little bit on the specific barriers that people in these categories face when trying to access the housing they need. So for example, people who have spent time in prison, if they have a criminal record, once they're out, the difficulties they face in often getting onto housing lists came up quite a lot. The attempt is to highlight that homelessness results from a combination of factors, personal and structural. But the fact is that prolonged homelessness is rooted in social and financial policy decisions made by governments and their failures to address the inequality of access to essential services such as homelessness support and healthcare. And there is enough enough literature evidence to say that it is ultimately the government's responsibility to ensure that nobody remains homeless. So you may face homelessness because of a relationship breakdown or because of a change in your personal circumstances. But if you remain homeless, then that is definitely the responsibility of those in power. The report also seeks to highlight the close link between housing and health. And I think this is what we try to show a little bit through our report, is to say that homelessness is not just an issue of housing, but it's also an issue of health. We met healthcare professionals who highlighted the importance of housing in the context of people experiencing homelessness. We also met who also have multiple disadvantages as a result of entrenched inequality and complex unmet needs. Homelessness is therefore, like I said, and we also met healthcare professionals who spoke about access to primary healthcare, which continued to be a challenge for people experiencing homelessness, especially those who were sleeping rough or were sofa surfing. The continued sort of very siloed approach towards mental health care, drug and alcohol dependency as a barrier is also discussed in the report. I'll quickly close here, but it would be impossible to talk about homelessness in England without acknowledging that at the root of this widespread and prolonged homelessness is the lack of truly affordable housing caused by a lack of investment to build sufficient housing stock, the rising rents, and a fall in real incomes. So basically, income's not keeping up with inflation. This situation, coupled with capping and freezing local housing allowance, introduction of the bedroom tax, and freezing social security benefits, have meant that accessing adequate housing on the private rental market is extremely difficult for most people living in poverty. The report also acknowledges that austerity measures have also deeply impacted local authorities and their ability to spend on homelessness assistance. Local authorities told us about the stresses and strains of bidding for short-term projects and the undue preference to crisis response rather than prevention efforts and resource allocations. And this came out quite strongly where sort of even, and we see this even in the rough sleeping strategy, where sort of it's all about let's end rough sleeping, but not so much on how are we going to prevent a situation where people are sort of pushed to the brink of homelessness. So, I mean, and as we've said time and again, sort of the rough sleeping strategy is only the tip of the homelessness iceberg. And if the government is serious about tackling the issue, it needs to address sofa surfing, unsuitable temporary accommodation, and also put many more resources into sort of prevention and into building like much more social housing stock. As the report highlights, there's quite, the UK is bound to the International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights, which recognizes the right to housing. So one of our campaign goals is really to get the UK government to basically bring into domestic law and policies what it has agreed to do internationally. So I'll just quickly run through some of our recommendations. So we are asking for the government to abolish the criteria for priority need and intentionality for determining entitlement to housing. We are asking them to take steps through amendments to immigration legislation to ensure that every person, regardless of whether they're subject to immigration control, has access to essential services to avoid homelessness and access their right to an adequate standard of living. This is as per international human rights law. And we are also asking them to take urgent steps and prepare a roadmap with concrete targets to fulfill unmet housing needs, including by building and enabling local authorities to provide adequate and affordable housing for every person who needs it. And most importantly, engage in a process of genuine consultation with people experiencing homelessness, service providers, civil society organizations, membership groups, to develop a human rights compliant national housing and homelessness strategy and ensure that there is sufficient funding and administrative support to realize the right to adequate housing for all. I'll end here, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
That's brilliant, Malavika. There's so much to take on in such a short space. So I can see that there've been a range of comments, and I guess if I was to kind of sort of weave a path through all of the comments that have been coming through, is that we've almost got this, and I know this is a kind of quite overused term at the moment, is about this perfect storm, but it does appear to be a kind of a perfect storm in the housing sector for the kind of the various elements which are coming together to kind of just aggravate the situation for individuals. So if it's okay with you, I'll try and pick apart some of the aspects of the themes that have been coming through.
Sure.
And I think if I start really almost at the top, where Brian highlighted early on in your discussion about how certainly this is not just about bricks and mortar, it is about the people, and it's the people that make the homes where people live, but that we've seen an increasing shortage and a reduction in the availability of truly affordable housing in this domain. And I'm going to flip Brian's question around just slightly and just say, is this ultimately a question of lack of political will to a lack of political will to really change the status quo and to invest properly in housing?
Yeah, I mean, it would appear to be, I mean, because what we've seen sort of in in the history of sort of social housing in this country, we saw sort of that enough investment changed the terrain around, and where there was a huge, in the 50s and 60s and 70s, a huge amount of investment in social housing that's made housing available for a lot of people. And then we see sort of the right to buy scheme coming in, less and less being invested in it. So it's really sort of policy decisions that have then determined the availability of housing in this country. And I think that is what sort of our report is trying to say, that when you use a human rights lens, you can then also hold the government to account for its policy decisions. So it's not only about going to court, because when the government sort of agrees to take on sort of or implement the right to housing, it's not only about the remedy where a violation takes place, but also putting in enough resources to make sure that they fulfill the right to housing. So just to digress a little bit, so as many of you might know, sort of government obligations and many human rights, and not just the right to housing, are sort of three levels of housing. So I mean, three levels of obligations. So you have the respect, protect, and fulfill. So if we just take the housing example, the respect aspect of government duties would be to, well, if you have housing, to ensure that your right to that is respected, that you're not forcibly evicted from your home or arbitrarily evicted from your home. That would be the respect side. The protect side of the duty from a human rights perspective would be to make sure that no third party, so your landlord, does not arbitrarily evict you, does not raise rents, etc. So that is where the government comes in. So it's not enough for the government to say, well, this is between the landlord and Darren. They have a duty to make sure that there are laws and structures in place that would prevent exploitation. And the third is the fulfill aspect of the human right to housing, where the government is not only has to respect and protect those who already have housing, but to fulfill this right by building more housing for those who may not have it. And that's what we're trying to do in this report, is to say that once you use a human rights perspective, then this political will that you have said, or these social and fiscal policies that have led to this sort of affordability of housing crisis, we would be able to hold the government to greater account if we used sort of a human rights approach. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Yeah, I think it does, because and it also shows that we've had successive governments of different colours. So I wasn't kind of drawing you in on
no, absolutely.
Successive governments of different colours, purported to be across the political spectrum over decades, which have kind of contributed to the situation. There's been opportunities to reform or to repeal some of the policies that were in place, and they haven't chosen to do so. So so from TAROE Trust perspective, one of the things that we have been calling for is slightly narrower, because our focus is slightly narrower on people who live within the regulated, often referred to as social housing sector. But we think that there's a right to be able to rent affordable housing.
There is.
And we're often lambasted for that, because they say, well, there's not enough housing that's available. But there's not enough housing that's available because there hasn't been the investment in the housing in the first place. So exactly. It's not that the claim to have a right to affordable rented housing is wrong. It's the fact that we've just not put the systems and infrastructure in place to invest in ensuring, as a nation, that there is a sufficient range of truly affordable housing. We've got lots of questions on that specifically, but I see James has got his hand up. So
yeah, I was just going to contribute a bit more to that question about political will. I think it was interesting to see on Monday, Lisa Nandy at Labour conference came out and said that they hoped they want to deliver enough social housing that social housing then becomes the second largest tenure of housing, after the private rental market overtook social housing, right? I think in like 2012-ish. So they want to refill the kind of social housing stock. So I think that's an interesting kind of and maybe not that unsurprising, but interesting kind of announcement by Labour, what their plans if they were in power. But then you also saw, I think, in Keir Starmer's speech yesterday, talking about Labour now being the party of home ownership, right? And I think there's an interesting like tension there where they're trying to commit to what we would see as like one of the fundamental solutions to this crisis, and particularly playing to kind of maybe a traditional base, to then also trying to draw in support from maybe that centre ground of the home ownership, you know, where they see there being kind of, that's where they might take votes on and to win a general election. And like, obviously, I'm not here to pass comment on political party techniques and tactics, but I just think it's interesting that they're trying to, the announcements that they're making are very all-encompassing of all of those sectors. And I think if we think about why successive governments have kind of had this very strong focus on home ownership, I mean, I saw in Brian's question, he asks a bit more about kind of, you know, what do you think about the over focus on like home ownership? I mean, this week, you know, we're seeing some of the cracks in the system of home ownership, right? Interest rates are going up. If you've got a mortgage on a fixed term, or if you're on a variable rate mortgage, like you're going to be really nervous about what your mortgage repayments look like in the next few months. So we're seeing actually home ownership maybe isn't this kind of golden egg that like successive governments have shown it to be, because actually it can be massively impacted by kind of wider economic markets. So yeah, I just think it's interesting that we are seeing a lot of noise about housing at the moment, and you know, home ownership itself, I think, will be brought into question a bit more, and you know, we might see that help support this move to building more social housing, because it's demonstrating the fragility of the private rental market, and also like the home ownership market as well.
Yeah, thanks for that, James. You've reminded me of a series. Each year, Chartered Institute of Housing produces a kind of an annual State of the Nation, and for a number of years in the kind of mid 2010s, there was quite a strong point that was made about comparative levels of subsidy for different tenures. And they highlighted that the amount of subsidy, we should kind of not forget, the amount of subsidy that was going into home ownership far outstripped the amount of subsidy that was going into rented accommodation in the regulated housing sector. So this kind of sort of notion that you know, the regulated sector is highly subsidized, and then you've got kind of the free market of the home ownership is a complete myth when you look at the amount of funding that has been allocated on a policy basis to home ownership. And now we maybe see some of the chickens coming home to roost with inflation and related interest rate rises. So a question which kind of has been highlighted there is one of affordability, and kind of a corresponding policy which we've seen operated within the regulated sector is above inflation rents being applied year on year on the basis that rent settlement is allowing landlords to either reinvest the proceeds of the revenue or use that revenue to go to the money markets to borrow and then to service that debt for investment in new supply, instead of there being capital grants being available from government. So what that means is you've effectively got people who currently rent, and you've already highlighted in your report, have been rationed, so have had to overcome a number of hurdles to get access to that housing, are then having to pay a proportion of their rent, which year on year gets less affordable because it's above inflation increases, to support new supply, often of new supply of home ownership based housing. That just seems to be skewed and further aggravating the position. Would your kind of findings support that as something that's problematic?
I mean, So for the report, we focused very much on sort of the homelessness aspect of housing, and where we looked at affordability was really on looking at how there was shortage in housing stock and why more and more people were pushed to the rental market, and then where the local housing allowance had been frozen for all intents and purposes, so was well below what people could, like adequate housing, and people were pushed into then more and more sort of unsuitable or unsafe housing because there just wasn't anything that they could afford with their local housing allowance. So that's where we looked at. We didn't, I mean, in this report, we didn't really look at your question, which I think is a very, very interesting question, and would require sort of some in-depth research to say like how to look at how this is happening. I'm sure there are lots of groups who've already done this work, but definitely the fact that rents are unaffordable for whatever reason to a bulk of the population is not in line with the UK's international human rights obligations on the right to adequate housing. And this is not to say, I mean, and I think international human rights standards are quite clear in terms of what is affordable, of course, varies. What is affordable for you may be very different from what is for me, or what is for next person in the room. But basically, affordability has to be such where I can pay for adequate housing that is safe, that is habitable, and when I say pay, I'm saying rent, or that is habitable, that provides enough space without having to cut back on food, on education, on health. And we're seeing this, that's clearly not the case. And we have even sort of newspapers like the Financial Times saying how sort of rents are eye-watering right now, especially in London and the bigger cities. So I think the fact that rents are unaffordable to a chunk of population is at odds with the UK's international human rights commitments, for sure.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Just for those participating, one of the things that we've called for is for more widespread application of a new way of setting rents, which would link rents not to the need to service debt, but to affordability. So the Joseph Rowntree Foundation came up with, I think, living rents was the concept. It's the idea that rents would be linked to no more than 35% of household income should be allocated towards servicing housing related costs. We think that that's a good measure as an alternative to kind of introduce a degree of additional affordability, which is not linked to kind of just the need to service debts. Yeah. So one of the other areas that I can see which kind of has come out increasingly was the kind of, you said about the case study and the not wanting, almost kind of people not wanting to rock the boat because of the fear of the repercussions of doing so. That was really interesting, and it's not surprising given some of the kind of direct contact that we have with tenants here at TAROE Trust. Just kind of unwillingness to complain because there's this kind of belief that, well, you should be thankful for what you've got, and if you complain, then your lot in life might get worse because of the potential reprisals. It was something which was raised in our webinar yesterday, even with the housing ombudsman, that some people just don't wish to raise because of what the potential consequences were. There was a recent report that was issued by the government's DLUC Select Committee on Housing into social housing regulation, issued just over 3 months ago. I know it's 3 months ago because the government had till the 20th of September to issue their response to the cross-party recommendations, and it's now overdue because they've not issued it. But one of the things that highlighted in that report was that there's a real imbalance of power between landlords and tenants, and it's that imbalance of power which is adding to it. Presumably, that imbalance of power is even greater where you're either homeless or facing a homelessness situation. And did that kind of highlight itself within the research?
Yes, it came up. It came up a few times, especially in the context of short hold tenancies and no fault evictions, where we saw that, you know, if a person was sort of living in inadequate housing, or where there was sort of, you know, it was uninhabitable for whatever reason, there was this fear of raising it with the landlord, because in that case you might just get an eviction notice, or get a sort of a section 21 notice. So so the fear of raising it, and I think again it comes more than not wanting to rock the boat. It comes from just saying that, look, if I complain against this, I'm going to be told that you need to move out of the house, and then I'm going to face homelessness, and then there's nothing there to hold me or to catch me if I fall. And that's where the problem is. And the stigma that I think Brian has also mentioned in the chat, I think is just so important. And we did see this coming again from, and this is, I think, sort of a larger goal that we really are keen on, is to present housing as a human right. It's not, social housing is not, or social housing or homelessness assistance is not something that is given to people who've quote unquote failed, and that's how it's seen. It's like, well, you weren't able to do your own thing, so now we're helping you out, and that's completely wrong. It is the duty of the government to make sure that there is affordable housing through various means, including through social housing. The stigma and the stigma essentially stems from the fact that housing is seen as an act of charity or a benefit. They don't want to see it as a human right. And so people trying to claim that, or going to the council presenting as home, or facing or threatened with homelessness, sometimes shy away from it just because of the stigma at how they will be sort of treated, by different people in the process. And it's really sad. Like, even just hearing those, like, you felt, no, this is your right. You shouldn't be made to feel this way, to access something which is a fundamental human right.
Yeah. Really pleased that you've highlighted the issue of stigma. It's something for quite a while we've been highlighting. I recently wrote the foreword to a follow-up research report by Newcastle and Durham University researchers based at those two institutions, which have highlighted a number of issues around the issue of stigma in the regulated sector, and how some of those things can be addressed, but there is quite a mirroring of the recommendations and the findings with your own report in terms of it largely stemming from successive policy positions of government, the lack of investment in the sector, resulting in it kind of being residualized, that you should be thankful for what you've got, but at the same time, that's why there's this kind of wider societal stigma. So just to kind of to highlight, we've got a follow-up webinar on that very research report on the 26th of October.
Okay.
So if you're Malavika and James, if you want to join, please sign up for that as well. I noticed that you identified a number of specific groups which were particularly advantaged. You highlighted, for instance, women that were disadvantaged, people who were not originally from this country, for instance, and so one of the areas which was raised right at the beginning of the questions were about young people, and certain under 20s, single men. Perhaps that came out with your third category in some instances, if it related to those perhaps that have been in the criminal justice system, but more generally about young men. Or anything? Was there anything in that as an additional theme?
So not in our report, and this is not, and it wasn't a theme in our report, not because they aren't a particularly vulnerable category.
Yeah.
And something I'd like to sort of emphasize is that the three categories that we sort of focused on were the ones that we could draw out based on our interviews. So it's not to say that these are the three most vulnerable or the only vulnerable categories or the particularly disadvantaged categories. These are the ones that we sort of pulled out from sort of the spread of our interviews. Having said that, young people has, like in our discussions with organizations working in the sector, sort of young people and homelessness came up a lot. It is a big issue, and actually we were sort of asked at one point, very early on in the research, why is it that you're not focusing on young people? And sort of our response to that was, well, this is our first piece of homelessness. In England, it'll have to necessarily sort of take a much broader shape, looking at sort of the law and policy structure before we sort of focus on only one category of people. But yes, I think it's a very, very burning issue. I do know, like, there are lots of organizations that are working on it and need to work on it, because like that between that 16 to sort of 25 age is when you fall through those cracks again of, are you priority need, are you not, are you a child, and where you fit in to get the homelessness support you need. In people who have spent time in prison and homelessness, I mean, again, we didn't come across very many young people in the interviews we did, but that's again not a reflection of, you know, of this group generally. It was just like, you know, we sort of who we met and through the groups we met. But no, it is a massive problem, and there was at one. And we did sort of consider focusing on young people at one point, and then felt, no, I think we just need to take a step back and take a more broader view.
Sorry, Darren, just to add on that though, we've at Amnesty UK, we've been working with a young person with part of our campaign work, and they previously experienced homelessness when they were kind of 16, 17 years old, and they told me about the priority needs criteria. When you turn from 17 to 18, you fall out of that priority need criteria, and so you're no longer local authority, no longer kind of, you know, has you in their pool, as it were, for homelessness assistance. And they were like, well, nothing has changed in your, just by aging, you know, a few days or a few months, like your ability to work, your ability to kind of fulfill your basic needs, which are impacted by your lack of housing, right? The fact you're experiencing homelessness, you know, it has such a huge impact on other forms of rights. Like that none of that changes, but you just, because of the way the rationing system, which, you know, leads all the way back to the lack of affordable housing that we've already talked about so much. But I think this is a really stark example of how that rationing system is failing, because we do hear, you know, and understandably from local authorities, and Malavika we'll talk about this maybe a bit more, but, you know, we do hear that, you know, people say, well, we need the rationing system, right? We need priority need. And we're not saying that there shouldn't be any form of prioritization. What we're calling for is the very kind of arbitrary, we think, or the kind of very, like, there's no room within the system to allow kind of you know, there's no room in the system to allow people to be offered assistance, or it's just very like black and white the way that it's applied. And yeah, the age, I think, is one very clear example. And the other example in the report, as Malavika said, is women particularly who have children, but their children might be taken into social care or given to a family member to look after, because and then they're no longer seen as being in priority needs because they no longer have a direct dependent that they're providing for. And again, it's really clear, you know, often people are voluntarily giving up their children in that circumstance to, you know, often into like a family environment, because that's the best thing for the child, but it then impacts on their ability to achieve that assistance. So yeah, I think age is definitely an interesting one when it comes to highlighting, I think, that priority, the flaws with the current system and the flaws with the current rationalization.
That's really helpful, James. I'm looking in terms of the various chat and the themes that are coming out of there. Obviously, one of the really big themes is the fact that there's been a kind of a strangle on local authority finances for a long period of time, and that's resulted in minimal amounts of public house building within the sector of any tenure. And we've seen some kind of small local authority companies being established in recent years, but there's nothing of scale that could compare even to the housing association sector, let alone the private house builders that we're seeing. So I think one of the kind of points that you're making is that if housing is made a right, then the government policy will have to follow from that, because it will presumably, therefore, you would, and hopefully you could correct me if I'm wrong, presumably, therefore, that you may see a resulting greater commitment to funding of housing supply as a result of that, in order for the government's obligations to meet that housing need be made. Presumably, that there wasn't anything that there's not within your report. It's not kind of one. It's not preferring one tenure over the other, albeit though it kind of is almost implicit within that if it was affordable and it was kind of public or quasi-public, then there might be greater sort of ability for the state to be able to fulfill its obligations to those groups, if that makes sense. So would that be a fair reading of the implicit kind of repercussions of as a consequence of making that the human right that you're calling for?
Yeah, so what we're trying to say is that, like you said, once the government sort of incorporates the human right to housing in domestic law and policy, like any other human right, they would have to be held accountable to not only sort of, in terms of, people taking cases to court and saying, well, my right to housing was violated and, this was a human rights violation, but also they would be held accountable for not investing enough in affordable housing, because as I said, that would be the fulfill aspect of the right to housing. So it would then, whereas right now, government decisions on investing in housing, in affordable housing, etc., are merely in the realm of policy. This would make them sort of obligated from a human rights perspective, and more accountability in that sense, where we could question, well, you've put in place these austerity measures. However, how does that sit with your obligation on implementing the right to housing and making sure that there is enough affordable housing? International human rights law and sort of that sort of the framework we follow does not really, law and standards do not really prescribe one type of housing over another, as you said. It's very much about if housing is affordable, is habitable, so is safe and secure, provides enough space, is well located in terms of access to essential services, then whether it is ownership, it is social housing, it is, and the rights of people living in there are protected from arbitrary rent increases or evictions. It doesn't say which type of sort of method is preferred. But looking at sort of the situation in England right now, where more and more people are pushed into the private rented sector, where rents are completely unaffordable, there isn't enough sort of social housing, which is truly affordable, not the sort of the new definition of affordable housing that the government uses, but truly affordable housing. I think in that context, one of the ways forward is to just build more truly affordable housing through the social housing rented sector or through other means. But as far as international law and standards, they don't prescribe one method over the other, as long as people's rights are protected and they have a safe place to live.
I wonder, therefore, given we seem to be a bit sort of lame in this country, and truly, I mean, there's legislation which kind of has. You talked about, for instance, habitability, and there are legislation which talks about fit for human habitation as an example. But when you look at obviously, as your report highlights, that there are some serious failings. Is there anything sort of internationally that you have come across which you would say that it's being done a lot better as an exemplar? Or if not, is that something that is a kind of a thing which we probably need more research doing?
We definitely need more research, and it's always, I think, we'll have to look at different. I mean, there is, unfortunately, I mean, I wish there was, but there is no one example where we can sort of say, well, look at how X country is doing something, in every aspect of housing. There are different aspects. So, for example, Finland is always sort of put forward as an example of a country that's dealt with street homelessness and through the housing first approach. The thing with England is that it isn't a situation, and we've seen sort of situations in different countries where there's nothing at all. There is something. There are sort of some provisions in place, some sort of support in place, some assistance in place, some regulations, some standards. There are. I mean, to be fair, it's not a situation where sort of people are living and operating in a vacuum. It's just that they are not enough, or they don't reach that level of where the residents of those homes are properly protected. So whether it is the housing safety system, or whether it is the monitoring of that system, whether it just feels that it needs to be sort of dialed up so that the protection is complete, so that there is more accountability in the system, that people can challenge their living situation and not face stigma or even the fear of being evicted. So I think it's sort of, in a way, I think it's encouraging to see that there is something to build on. Actually, there's quite a lot to build on in this country, and so it's not sort of, you're not starting from zero. You've got it's just a question of making that stronger and making the government more accountable.
Well, I think that's a really positive place for us to kind of pause for now, and reflect that on the positives that are available, because it's quite a miserable report in some respects when you look at the kind of what's shining a light on a number of the problems. But so it's good to see that there is there's hope for the future, and I think it's really important that the recommendations they take get some traction, because it is such a kind of vital issue, which is very close to obviously our own activities here. So I said we have a few minutes for a quick update on a few other things. But before I do, can I thank collectively James and Malavika for coming and joining us today and talking about this brilliant piece of research. Really pleased to see it released. Excellent. And thank you for explaining it in such accessible way, which has helped promote the debate. My other kind of additional input was just for those that are present today, was just to highlight that there's a lot of change in the sector at the moment in relation to a movement towards more proactive consumer regulation. And one of the things which could move forward is tenant satisfaction measures. The regulator of social housing released tenant satisfaction measures in the final form last Wednesday. So we're now clear about what they're going to look like in terms of landlord performance and accountability. Landlords are being required to start collecting details around that from next April. The second issue, which we've touched on a bit actually today, is about rents. The government are currently consulting up until the 12th of October on capping rents because of the massive levels of inflation that could see rent increasing by 11-12% if they were not to take this action. So the proposals put forward caps at 3%, 5% or 7%. They appear to have a preference for 5%. Anyone goes to our website, you'll see that we've put a draft statement, consultation response position statement out, and we're asking for feedback on that ahead of the deadline so that we can respond. And I mentioned at the beginning, we held a webinar yesterday. It was rearranged from a couple of weeks ago. It couldn't take place because of the Queen's funeral, but it took place yesterday, and that's now on our YouTube channel. And then finally, we've got next week's webinar. Joining instructions will be coming out later today. Will be a guest speaker from the regulator of social housing about some of their changes. So they're the things. Malavika, you had something to add?
Yes, I just want to be a little cheeky and grab 2 minutes of your time.
Please do.
And sort of hand over to James, who I think if he can just share a little bit of what Amnesty is planning to do in terms of campaigning, I think that we'd be very grateful for that.
Thanks, Malavika. Darren, do you want to finish your bit first? Or
no, it's fine. No,
yeah,
go ahead.
Thanks, Malavika. Yeah, just really briefly. So we do have a petition to the government, which I've posted in the chat now. So we're calling for the Secretary of State for Levelling Up Housing Communities to invest in more social housing and to remove that triple barrier that we've been talked about so much in this report. We also have a lot of our Amnesty members and local groups now organising petition drives, going to events, organising stalls and meeting with their local MPs to put forward our calls. So if anyone would be interested in getting more involved with the campaigning perspective, either encouraging other people to get involved or organising in your local communities with homelessness organisations, like please get in touch with me as well. I'll just pop my email address in the chat and I'm sure Darren can share that around as well afterwards. We're currently at the Labour Party conference, which is happening at the moment, and we're going to the Conservative Party conference next week as well. Yeah, I think that's a broad. So we also, just to tell you quickly about last week, Malavika and I attended a festival here in London in Finsbury Park, which was for people experiencing homelessness, mainly rough sleeping. And we were there talking about the right to housing in this work and our campaign. And just to say, I think the response there was incredibly positive, both from people who have this direct experience, but also a broad range of like service providers from Islington Council, Haringey, Camden were all there. And yeah, we had a really positive response around this notion of housing being a human right rather than a chargeable reward. So we really feel like the ground is shifting a bit as well with this narrative. Like a big part of this campaign is changing people's perspectives when it comes to the issue of homelessness, but housing more broadly as well. And yeah, we're really starting to see that, I think, play out on the ground, which is great. But yeah, if anyone would like to get more involved in the campaign, there's my email address in the chat, or you can just sign the petition and you'll be updated as well as the campaign progresses. But yeah, thanks Malavika and thanks Darren.
Thanks, James. We'll include in the follow-up information which we send out, we'll include your email address and a link to the petition in the materials that we send out. If you're comfortable with that, I can see nods, so that's great. Okay, well, we're out of time. Thank you once again to James and Malavika. Brilliant topic of discussion today. Good to see everybody that managed to join us as well. We'll be up on the YouTube channel within the next 24 hours. And just remains to say, have a great day and thank you very much. Good to see you all again. Thanks. Bye now. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.